This will be Chapter 18, Commercialization of Sex. We're going to start our journey through this chapter talking about sex in advertising. I know a number of you had mentioned in your perusal comments kind of being surprised about the ways in which sex is used either directly or indirectly in advertising, and how you didn't really notice it until it was all kind of combined into one place. And that's really kind of the secret weapon of advertisers, is by using sex as a way of gathering your attention and directing your attention to their products, but also they're very much echoing cultural standards and attitudes, particularly attitudes about women and sexuality in their attempts at marketing. Now, your authors mentioned some specific examples that really raised the ire of the public, particularly among women. A Burger King ad that's pictured here was called into question. One that just remained and continues to be used today is the Nike Just Do It ad. AT&T's ad is a more subtle example of a kind of double layered message, where reaching out and touching someone can be a physical act, but it can also be a communication tool. The Timex ad, which is, goes back to my childhood, always had this double meaning, and it was used. I can remember very clearly some of my peers in middle school and high school would use the takes a licking and keeps on ticking as a way of describing girls in our school. The Toyota ad, again, another subtle ad, but it's a way of kind of building a separate, a secondary message that has sexual connotations to it. The Gillette ad often had, both in magazine and print ads, but also in television commercials, routinely had a scantily clad, often a woman dressed in a man's shirt, ostensibly with no underwear on, kind of draping herself around a shaving man's shoulders, and describing that as the best a man can get. So what advertisers often do, frequently by using sexual imagery either directly or indirectly, is to use sex to get attention, to engender positive feelings, and get you to buy products. Now, here are a few just straightforward examples of using products, sometimes directly. Certainly Abercrombie Fitch has, over the years, garnered a fair amount of criticism because of their use of particularly very young-looking models that often look like they're right on that edge of puberty in their catalogs. Their catalogs were always kind of borderline pornographic, and often they had to kind of backtrack on certain photographs to get around regulators with their catalogs. And as you can see, big brands often, especially in print ads, will use very, very sexual imagery, and sometimes it's imagery that is espousing certain kinds of violence towards women, as in the Dolce & Gabbana ad, where you have several men surrounding a woman who has her hands pinned by one of the men, and what this suggests pretty clearly is an impending gang rape. Now, online sexuality, and like a lot of our chapters in this book, you're going to jump from one topic to another topic to another topic as we talk about sexuality being commercialized. The advent of the internet, through the 1990s and into the present, so over the last 30 years, there's just been an absolute revolution in the way sex is being commercialized through the internet. So you have online access, and for your generation, you've had access your entire lives to a whole universe of sexual content and sexual access that previous generations never had. From the minute the internet got started, the pornography industry kind of leapt onto that train and really pushed access to pornographic imagery. But in addition, the emergence of social networking really lent itself to the creation of novel forms of sexual commerce. Everything from learning how to solicit pornography through online means to soliciting prostitutes through Craigslist. There are lots and lots of avenues online. So if you go into the internet, and I'm sure this is not a surprise to you at all, there are a number of ways in which you can find access to sexual content and sexual business online. Though the content is extensive and variable, some of it is very transparent and easy to access. Others of it is buried more on the so-called deep web for access. And countries around the world vary tremendously in how much control they exert over sexual content. Some countries are very, very restrictive in terms of what their populace can access online. And other cultures are very loose about it in terms of what can be shown and what cannot be shown. For example, there's a constantly emerging kind of set of norms for what you can post and what you can't post, say, on YouTube or on Facebook. And those standards, they kind of have to move with community standards of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for posting. Now, your authors talk about a variety of benefits of pursuing sexual content, but also sexual contact through online means. In some cases, people can look to the internet to find information, to educate themselves. Certainly this is useful in a variety of ways for people if they don't have adequate sex education through their school or through other means, such as through parents or peers. They can go to reputable websites to educate themselves and to get basic information about their sexual health. You can also access anonymous STI testing through online sources, and I've shared information about that with you on D2L. Also, people find that in modern culture, forgive the phrase modern culture, since the advent of the internet, we've seen the emergence of online dating and online matchmaking and online seeking of partners. So many people use the internet and various services on it, like Match.com, in order to identify potential partners for dating. In other cases, people aren't looking for a relationship, they're looking for someone to have sex with. And there are numerous, uncountable numbers of online sources that can be employed in order to find a sex partner. In some cases, people use the internet to maintain relationships when they are separated. We're certainly all learning an awful lot about that distance thing, but long-distance partners have been using the internet for this purpose for a very long time. In some cases, people use the internet and various apps and websites for it to have sexual experiences in that online environment. Also, it's a way, and this has always been the case, that the internet is a way for people who are in marginalized communities to meet one another, to connect with one another. From the very beginnings of the internet, you saw communities popping up of people who are LGBTQ, who could connect with each other, support each other. I think one real clear example is the trans community, which is a marginalized group of people who can reach out and connect with each other in an online environment where it's safe. For some people, it's also, the internet is also a safe place to try on new ways of being, where you don't have to kind of put on a new identity for your friends and family. You can try it out with people who don't have that direct access to your life. and that it can be a way of exploring and thinking about new things. The internet has also kind of destigmatized and created an easier pathway for purchasing sex products, such as sex toys, in addition to birth control devices and such. It used to be that, acquiring sex-related products meant you had to go to an adult store. You had to physically walk in, and for a lot of people, that's just very uncomfortable for them. So having the ability to go on Amazon and purchase sex toys it certainly changed the atmosphere for people quite a bit. There are disadvantages, though, to either accessing partners or accessing pornography or accessing any kind of sexual information online. And you're probably familiar with many of those. I know from your comments and on Perusal and your questions that you've posed on the discussion forums, you have lots of concerns about cybersex crime, and there are lots of varieties of it. It seems like every month or so, some new, bizarre, difficult, painful way of hurting people arises in the internet space. And certainly cybersex crime is one of those. In some cases, you have people who are deceiving others. So they may post false profiles with false information on dating sites or on social media in order to catfish people or to defraud them, lure them into relationships and steal their money or harm them in other ways, including sexually assaulting them and even murdering them. There's also a school of thought, although it is complicated and controversial, where people's tendencies to overuse online sex in whatever form, whether they are finding the private accounts on Instagram or whatever other online source you have, where they're paying for sex online, or they're viewing pornography. There is the potential for people to become addicted, depending on how you want to use that term, to online sex. There's also the really dangerous and problematic fact that there are pedophiles online. And these are people who often will attempt to identify and then lure children into online connections and contacts, lure them into relationships online, eventually trying to lure them into a physical interaction. These are individuals who often will masquerade as significantly younger people in order to kind of cultivate a relationship, kind of groom the person into meeting them and becoming committed to them. Now, we have to kind of take a step back and think about how, if we're going to look at this whole kind of universe of commercial sex and commercialization of sex, we have to think, where does sex intersect with the law? And saying it's complicated is really understating the matter. We're always in this really dangerous space of in between the private rights of individuals to their own sexuality and their own sexual behavior, and the issue of morality and ethics and appropriateness of behavior. There have always been, if you go around the globe or look historically within our culture, there have often been, really draconian laws against a variety of behaviors. It's only very recently, for instance, that you have laws that actually define raping someone who is your partner, your marital spouse, as a crime. Or there have been, until relatively recently, and I'm fairly sure you're going to have to fact check me on this, I think there are still some of these quote-unquote sodomy laws on the books in some states that essentially define any kind of sex that isn't penile vaginal heterosexual sex to be deviant and therefore something that is in violation of the law. Now, around the world, those kinds of laws that call into question certain forms of behavior are pretty common. But it's always complicated because you have this very woven together relationship between the private rights of individuals and the values and ethics of the culture. And that's where the law comes in. Now, your authors describe a continuum of types of offenses that have been criminalized that are related to sexuality and sexual behavior. And primarily, I should say, what's being described as being illegal is sexual behaviors or sexually motivated behaviors. So at the lower level, you have crimes that, or I shouldn't say lower level, in the category 1 group, you have acts that require enforcement. They must have, they demand that the government step in and say this is wrong. So in the category 1 acts, you have criminal acts that absolutely must be enforced, where laws against them must be enforced in order to protect people. So the examples that you're given there are things like rape and child molestation. Then you have in category 2, sexual behaviors that potentially can victimize others. So for example, when an exhibitionist shows his genitals to you, or when someone is peeping, they're being voyeuristic or taking photographs of you without your permission. Those have the potential to victimize others. You know, if you're just stripping for your own mirror, that's not a criminal act. If, however, you are showing your private parts to an unwitting person who has not consented for you to do that, then you are victimizing someone else, and it's illegal. Category 3 acts are acts that are in a grayer space, where determining whether or not the behavior is simply morally questionable or illegal becomes difficult, where it becomes harder to decide. And essentially, you know, a culture has to come to a consensus at some point and decide, you know, is prostitution illegal? And who do we punish? Do we punish the prostitutes? Do we punish the people who purchase prostitution? Or do we punish them both? Or with adultery, for example. Adultery is no longer, in the United States, illegal. It used to be. In many cultures the world around, cheating on your marital partner is a crime. So, you know, you can see how, depending on what the values and morals of a culture are, they're going to determine some of these grayer areas, like is prostitution actually illegal or is it not? And there you have, you know, the emerging kind of moral standards within a culture having to make a decision. In category 4, you have sex acts that consenting adults engage in. So for example, in some states, I mentioned earlier sodomy laws, oral sex, again, many of these sodomy laws kind of identified people who were not engaging. If they were engaging in sex, but it wasn't penile vaginal heterosexual sex, it was often defined as illegal. So that would include, say, oral sex or anal sex, sex with animals. Now, sex with animals, of course, you don't have a consenting adult engaged there, but many of these laws were very broad sweeping, and they included, you know, sex between people who were gay or lesbian, sex that involves simply a blowjob. Though in those cases, you have consenting adults who are engaging in behavior, and if they're caught, then they could be prosecuted. Now, in the United States, where we've moved steadily, you know, step by step away from criminalizing those kinds of behaviors. And you've certainly seen the finishing kind of blows in those arguments within your generation's lifespan. Certainly as I was growing up, most of the sodomy laws were still in effect. If you were gay and you were found out, or if you were having if you were caught, say, in a public bathroom having oral sex with a partner, you could be prosecuted. And in fact, many times people were. So as community attitudes towards homosexuality and frankly the acceptance of varied sexual expression has changed, the laws have had to change as well. And then finally, category 5, you have behaviors that don't involve sexual contact, but they tend to be related in some way to our sexuality. They can sometimes be criminalized and sometimes be considered crimes against persons. So, for example, I've been following a couple of cases coming out of Central America where you have women who have had miscarriages, but they were called into question, and it was suggested that they had voluntarily aborted their children and therefore they had murdered their children. So abortion is illegal in some of those cultures, and women, even when they spontaneously miscarry, are often called into question and are prosecuted even though they've done nothing wrong. So what you see here is the way in which sex and the law interact is complicated and is very much, just embedded into long-standing cultural debates. And you can see how, within a culture like ours, where you have very dramatic divides on issues like homosexuality and abortion and prostitution, you can see how there would be disputes and questions would arise that don't have easy answers. Now let's get into some more specifics. In a bygone era, you could ask your parents or not about these 888 numbers and how sometimes people would be surprised by their phone bills, finding out someone in their household has been running up massive charges for phone sex. So telephone conversations, it was kind of the precursor to online versions of this kind of commerce. But there used to be, networks of people who were hired to basically talk dirty on the phone and have phone sex with people, and they would charge by the minute, and it could be quite expensive for people. Now that has kind of been replaced by what's called camming or webcam sex or other sorts of internet or online ways of purchasing the time of a person who provides you with now not just a voice but also physical imagery for sexual purposes. It's becoming a larger and larger industry over time. Basically, it involves using a webcam to show a customer, a paying customer, who can see, who can direct, who can interact with the person who's performing on the other side. There are several of these sites out there. These probably aren't even the most popular of them because the industry is very, very quickly moving and evolving with time. One of the challenges for people who work in the industry, so people who cam as a way of making a living, is that they do rely on these outside of the usual commerce services in order to get payment. And that's because credit card companies are operating under federal law, and they will not take payments for sexual services of any sort. So camming exists in this weird space of not quite legal, not quite illegal. Essentially, under federal banking regulations, it is seen as prostitution, and therefore they will not allow their cards, their banks, to be involved in that kind of work. So there have to be, additional services that charge fees in order for people who can professionally to get payment. There are services that operate in order to find models who will cam and then pay them a a salary essentially, but also that salary is not guaranteed by level, and there can also be tipping involved. The services kind of, they vary tremendously in how well they treat their models, and some of them can be quite horrible in terms of the way they manage their business and work with models. In some cases, hiring people who are not quite old enough to be doing what they're doing, and in that case, law enforcement steps in because that's child pornography. In other cases, you just have economic exploitation of people who are vulnerable, wanting to make a name for themselves, seeing camming as a way of getting into show business in other ways. So it can be very lucrative and can be a very positive experience for people, but there are downsides to the business as well. Some of the downsides can involve, viewers who they pay their fee, but they behave inappropriately. There may be management issues where individuals are expected to be on camera, on job for hours and hours and hours of time without kind of relief. So since it is an unregulated industry, there aren't worker protection rules where you can't go to the EEOC and charge your webcam supervisor with overworking you. There just isn't that kind of regulation. So what some researchers have argued is that you've got, on the plus side, you have this ability for you as an individual to start an account, become a performer, to make connections with clients, to build a fan base, to really use your creativity and work within that fantasy zone for your clients. At the same time, being able to protect your own boundaries. In some cases, the camming world, offers people who would have been working in strip bars or in other aspects of the sex industry in ways that were far more difficult to control. I mean, at least with webcamming, you can block people. You can say no. You can just simply shut people down when they misbehave. If you're in a strip club, that's harder to do and it's less safe. So for many cammers, they argue that this is a far safer, more lucrative way of earning using their sexuality and their appearance and their performance skills. And it's safer and they have more control. The downside is if you're working for people who exploit you, who use you, or if you don't have kind of the infrastructure for helping you to protect yourself, then it can be problematic. Now, mentioning stripping, strip clubs are ubiquitous. There are strip clubs that are high-end. There are strip clubs that are low-end. There are strip clubs that feature women almost exclusively, and there are strip clubs that feature men. Most strip clubs are directed at male viewers who watch female dancers. There are strip clubs that are really targeted towards an LGBTQ audience, but by far, if you look at the number of adult entertainment businesses, most of them do kind of target that market of heterosexual men who want to watch women. The laws about how much clothing can be taken off are really a jurisdictional issue. They vary county to county and in some cases township to township. So you have like ordinances that determine the physical location of the business, what kinds of dancing can take place in the business, how many feet you have to stay apart from someone while you're dancing, and how much clothing can you take off. How much physical contact can there be? Can you touch someone? Can you not touch someone? Can they touch you? And so on. Table dancing is one type of performance where the person dances or disrobes at the customer's table or on the table in front of that seated customer. There may be rules about exactly how many feet have to be between the dancer and the customer. And in some cases, ordinances will make table dancing impossible. You can't do it. Lap dances are another version of regulated behavior within these types of clubs. And here's where you have, varying amounts of physical contact with the patron. And in some cases, you can have people who either masturbate while the lap dance is going on, or they achieve some sexual satisfaction during that interaction. Now, a lot of jurisdictions, counties, townships, cities, they will have specific laws that state that the lap dances are not going to happen. At least they'll say that they aren't. Other jurisdictions, they don't have rules against it. So it really varies from location to location as to exactly what is and is not permitted in those establishments. In some facilities, in some clubs, dancers are paid by the hour. In others, the dancers are kind of freelance. There are fees, and they have to, pay for their space, pay for their access to the stage, and they may get commissions and tips and so on. So there are possibilities for exploitation here. Some people who strip, if they are especially at higher upscale clubs with a more well-off clientele, they may find that they can make an extraordinarily good amount of money by working in strip clubs. In other cases, though, if you're talking not about the high class or more upscale strip clubs, that's when you tend to find people who are being taken advantage of. They're paid a very low salary, or they rely on tips, and they may have to pay for fees to use the space, including the stage, and then rely really strongly on tips from people. Clubs vary tremendously in how much security they give dancers and how much protection they give them from people who are paying to see them dance. So in some cases, strippers may report is that they feel pressured by clients, often followed by them or talked to by them, and pushing them to give them more explicit sex in order to get more money from customers. So one of the downsides, certainly to stripping, is that dancers may face a lot of pressure from sometimes managers, but often just from their clients, from the people who come into these establishments and expect them to engage in essentially prostitution when that may or may not be their intention. Now, a couple of you mentioned that you had never heard of erotic massage parlors before, which was a little surprising to me, because you can find them. They're around. They're a little more common in large cities than certainly in other areas, but they're out there, definitely. These are places that market themselves as providing massage therapy, but it becomes pretty quickly evident that what's being offered is sexual services, and very much, the amount of contact and the type of sexual services being offered really run this really delicate line in terms of legal and not legal. The types of sexual services typically involve hand jobs and oral sex, sometimes intercourse, and it's a paid service. So in a lot of jurisdictions, this is pretty clearly prostitution, and it is illegal in most places. And communities, when massage parlors move in, they get very concerned, because you have people coming in and out, and getting sex services, and communities are often very concerned about what kind of impact this is going to have on their community and their property. what's been found and I won't say this is a new phenomenon, it's a very old phenomenon, but it's been made more clear to the public that this is happening. Many women, especially in large cities who work in these massage parlors, have been trafficked. In many big cities, what you might see in a massage parlor is people who are apparently Asian or Eastern European, who may or may not speak English. If they speak English, they speak it not very well, and they often appear to be very, very young. So it's commonplace kind of in these large city areas to see people who you might suspect are not necessarily willingly participating in the work that they're engaged in. So many of the women in this industry have been trafficked into it and are trapped. Not all, but quite a few. Now, you should be clear that this is not the same as therapeutic massage. Your authors make a point of stating that you can go to a massage therapist, and that is not what's being described here. These are clearly places that are it becomes quite evident just looking at the pictures like the one I've presented here, with the stars and the hearts, and that's not just massage. That's there's sex going on there. So the erotic massage parlors are often in that gray space between legal, not legal, and as a result, they garner a fair amount of attention from police. Now, community attitudes about adult-oriented businesses, and I did some checking. I was trying to kind of get a handle on what the Ohio statutes are right now, and the lingo is kind of hard to wrap your head around as you're looking at these statutes. But essentially, you have sexually oriented businesses or adult-oriented businesses, and the statutes that are attached to them. As I mentioned before, the law tends to follow where community attitudes are on these issues. So residents, people who live in neighborhoods, typically don't want these adult-oriented or sexually oriented businesses right near where they live. They would prefer that they not be near their schools. They would prefer that they not be in residential areas. Now, it really depends on what kind of business you're talking about. Many of you talked in class about the Adult Mart in Alliance and how it's right next to the Aldi's. It's right on this main drag in the commercial area on State Street. Well, there are a lot of adult-oriented businesses like that where you can get pornographic videos and sex toys and sexually oriented clothing and things like that. In Belden Village, you can go to an adult store for sexually oriented materials and sex toys and so on, and then go around the corner to a strip club. So the attitudes that people have really depend on the type of business that you're talking about. If you're talking about places where people are stripping, but it's a bar that is more likely to cater to people who aren't quite as well off, residents typically get more negative about that. If, however, and again, right around Belden Village, there are two quote-unquote gentlemen's clubs that are very pristine looking on the outside, but basically they're strip clubs, but they're not seen as problematic. So it really depends on what the place looks like and who the residents believe is using them. So residents in general, when you ask them on questionnaires what they feel about adult-oriented businesses, generally they don't want them near where they live. They would prefer to be isolated in a downtown area that's non-residential, or where people who are poor live, or they need to be in clearly commercial areas that are not residential. Where you get complaints is where you have kind of intersections between those. For example, in North Canton, there are some sexually oriented businesses that while they are on a commercial street, they back up to apartment buildings and residential areas, and those kinds of businesses tend to get more criticism. So there are restrictions on locations. In some jurisdictions, they have restrictions about schools, they have restrictions about how close they can be to a residential area. There might be restrictions on other aspects of the physical structure itself. There is a tendency among people to believe that there is increased crime in areas where adult businesses reside. And there has been some research, and your authors make note of that. Some researchers have found lower numbers of crimes in these areas. But I will say you need to be careful in interpreting that kind of data. While it is true that just plunking an adult business into a place is not going to immediately cause an increase in crime. There is no causal relationship between adult-oriented businesses, such as strip clubs or adult stores that have pornographic videos or sex toys. There's no direct relationship between access to those businesses and crime rates. On the other hand, and again, this really depends on where these businesses are situated. There's, in some cases, the places where these businesses are permitted to open are already areas that have crime problems. They may be areas of the city or the county that are already problematic, and because of jurisdictional rules, because of laws or ordinances, those are the only places that those businesses are permitted to exist. So you need to be careful when you interpret that data, especially when your authors mention this finding of lower numbers of reported crimes. That may simply be an artifact of the fact that people don't live there. So you need to be careful in interpreting those findings. Now we get into kind of the tricky area of defining what pornography is. And for as long as there has been literature, and for as long as there has been photography, there has been an ongoing debate on what is pornographic and what is art, what is erotic and tasteful and what is obscene. And that's an ongoing debate that's incredibly difficult to come to any kind of consensus on. And it seems like every few years the debate is reopened anew as boundaries get pushed and new forms of pornographic material arise. So for example, I'm not sure that some of the original pornography and obscenity laws, I'm not sure if the people who articulated those laws and standards, or even the Supreme Court justices who ruled on them, could have imagined such a thing as, say, Twitter sex or Twitter porn or Pornhub. So we're kind of enmeshed in redefining this yet again. Now, when we talk about pornography, the typical way of defining it is in terms that are broad. So you have sexually explicit pictures, writing, images, they could be illustrations that involve sex. Now your authors also kind of make this distinction where there's frequently imagery of power and violence. That's not necessarily required for a definition of pornography, but what your authors are trying to do is distinguish between pornography and erotica. And in the way a lot, and your authors are not alone in this, the way many social scientists kind of make that distinction is with that issue of power and violence. So erotica is typically defined as sexually explicit material that doesn't have degrading or violent portrayals included in it. Now, here's a simple example of why there's no bright line between porn and erotica. 50 Shades of Grey was widely described as erotica, but at the same time, there is power and violence and degrading content included in it. So it very clearly exists within that weird space in between what seems to be obviously pornographic and what is artistically erotic. So there's no one way of really clearly distinguishing these concepts. Um, and I would kind of defy anyone who says that they have a clear way of distinguishing the two. Um, Degrading pornography, and this is a term that in some cases is used in legal arguments, this idea of degrading pornography, it's also commonly used among social scientists who are really trying to tease apart differential effects of viewing pornography. You have pornography that's not just sexually explicit, but it's designed to be debasing of people, where it's degrading, dehumanizing depictions. Now, typically, what you have is the target of the debasement is women, but it can be men, particularly in gay porn that has the degrading pornographic imagery of often very young men or men of color who are presented in this degrading context. But if you look at the whole of the pornography industry, the typical, person who's being dehumanized is a female. Now, violent pornography is when you have sexually explicit images, but it's also clearly sexually violent. And typically, this is pornography that involves males who are being sexually violent toward women. It could be anything from, enacting rape scenes, bondage, and brutality. But what makes it so violent is that it's being presented as this is an unwilling partner, that this is someone who doesn't want it, but experiences sexual release despite being violently abused. Now, this big long acronym, CUR BFHP, federal prosecutions and in federal law, you have very specific types of pornographic content that is federally illegal, and is often made the subject of federal cases. So if the pornography includes children, if it involves urination, rape, bestiality, which is involving animals, fisting, homicide, and pain, any of those can come to the attention of federal authorities, and people who are producing or selling that material or possessing it in some cases can be subject to federal prosecution. Now that's particularly the case if you're talking about images of children, whether it's still images or video of some kind. So that set of content is what's kind of seen in terms of federal law as a line that's not to be crossed, and therefore it's seen as not simply paraphilic. So once there's a whole genre of BDSM porn that is quite graphic and quite easy to access. If the line is crossed to where you have fisting, you have egregious acts of pain, such as stabbing people or beating them to the point of serious injury, or even snuff films where you are combining sex and murder, those are obviously crossing into that line of dangerous pornography. Now, this leaves out of the picture, in terms of criminality, what's often kind of euphemistically called softcore porn. And that's everything from your standard romance novels to what we usually see in advertising, the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated, and also more and more often today, sex scenes in film include much more female and male nudity than ever in the past. In previous generations, so say when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, you didn't see bare breasts, you didn't see backsides. It was salacious when NYPD Blue had showed a man's naked butt on primetime television. It was seen as really salacious. and there were, constant arguments about what you could and could not show on television, what you could and couldn't show in a film before it garnered an R rating or an X rating. Certainly those standards have changed dramatically. It's very commonplace to have female frontal nudity as long as there isn't pubic hair shown. And that seems to be one of the dominant lines that you're not supposed to cross. Now that we're all in the world of streaming and access to premium services like the HBOs of the world, what we started to see is what's often called the pornification of television. So if you think about the advent of Game of Thrones and similar other television programs, the increasing level, just the level and completeness of the nudity is certainly a more novel phenomenon. But that's all today kind of incorporated into what's considered quote unquote softcore porn. And it can, in some cases, again, I'll raise the example of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones frequently had scenes of rape, of abuse, of violence against mostly women, but also men in many ways that were very, very graphic. And in the 1980s and early 90s, those would have been considered to be X-rated material, but they're not anymore. So again, community standards really vary on how to define this type of material and to control it. So in contrast to softcore porn, you have so-called hardcore porn, where you have very graphic sexual encounters, pretty much anything that you would see on Twitter porn, where you have three-ways, where you have anal sex, where you have very graphic sexual encounters. That's considered to be hardcore, where there's no real narrative, there's no real kind of story being told, there's no character development, it's just about the sex and the graphicness of it. Now, when we think about the prevalence of porn, and I pulled this information from a report by Robert Weiss, if you really just want to get a sense of the density of how much porn there is out there and how big a business this is, Weiss estimates that about 12% of all internet sites involve pornographic material. That's a lot. 25% of searches are related somehow to sex, and that involves millions and millions of requests every day. Weiss estimates that about 35% of internet downloads are pornographic materials. It is a big business, and downloading that material, it costs money, and it makes people money. He estimates that 40 million Americans regularly visit, and this is self-reported data, so it's their own report that they are regular visitors to porn sites of whatever kind. 70% of men in one study reported, and this was between the ages of 18 to 24, 70% of them had visited a porn site at least once a month. So, and that's, of Americans in a survey study, self-reported, 70% of them had done so. The average age reported in these studies of first encountering internet porn was around 11. The largest consumers of internet porn, and this is data just looking at people who consume it, so they're watching it. It didn't give me data, it didn't show me whether that included downloading, but the largest consumer group is men from 35 to 49. So you're talking about adult men primarily looking for images of women. About a third of internet porn users are female, so 2/3 are male. The most popular, and I found this very curious to know that somebody had looked at this, the most popular day of the week for watching porn appears to be Sundays, and that's reported through sites like Pornhub, just looking at their traffic and how many people are logging on and how many people are watching. Sunday seems to be a big day for porn. And they also noted, and again, this is research looking at sites like Pornhub, the most popular day for watching porn appears to be Thanksgiving. I thought everyone was watching football. Apparently not. Now, anytime you talk about pornography, you have to bring in the legal concept of obscenity. Um, and like the word pornography, obscenity is a hard to define concept. And it takes on, legal importance because you have to have a way of operationalizing it. To use the scientific term, you have to have a way of concretely defining what this thing is, called obscenity. Um, so when you think of obscenity, one of the first things you need to do is put it in the, you have to put it into the context of, First Amendment protections of speech. So is this or is it not protected under the First Amendment? So can I create pornography and sell it and show it, have people consume it, and then argue, is that protected speech? Well, based on Supreme Court rulings, obscenity is unprotected by the First Amendment, for a variety of reasons that the Supreme Court has articulated. Obscenity laws, they tend to use terms like prohibiting lewd, filthy, or disgusting words or pictures. Now, lewd, filthy, and disgusting are just as hard to define as the word obscenity is hard to define. They really are, in the mind of the person who is using them to determine what's lewd or what's filthy and what's disgusting. One person's definition of what's disgusting may be another person's deeply erotic pleasure. So lawmakers have to really, and lawyers and justices have to really carefully articulate what they mean by lewd. Frequently, obscenity laws involve trying to articulate what materials are indecent, what depictions are indecent, versus things that are artistic expressions. So what obscenity laws often do is try to restrict in terms of, when and where and how certain kinds of materials can be presented. So there are some depictions, things that are speech or artistic expressions that may have a sexual nature, but they're still protected under the First Amendment. Obscenity, however, has to meet three separate criteria. So first, the dominant theme of the material has to be just sex. So it can't be, artistic in nature. So you could say the Game of Thrones is a story. It's a story and it has characters. It's artistic in whatever way. The fact that there's violent sex in it is not the primary dominant theme. In contrast, a pornographic product, if the dominant theme of the material is simply to provide people visual images of sex, that is the first standard. The second is that the material itself is patently offensive based on community standards. So would the average person in the community, when exposed to this material, would they find it offensive? Would they find it disgusting? Would they find it lewd and troubling to them? And then the material has to have no redeeming social value. So I remember in the 90s there was a case where Robert Mapplethorpe was a photographer. He would take pictures of men in the nude. They were some people would describe them as being patently offensive and lewd. Other people found them quite beautiful. I'll leave it up to you to go do a search on Robert Mapplethorpe and look at his images and decide for yourself. But when he was scheduled to do a show in Cincinnati, in a gallery, there was a lot of controversy because the photographs were homoerotic. They were these beautiful, suggestive images of nude men. And for many in the community, so again, you have to look at criterion B, the material must be patently offensive to the community. Many in the community saw this as homoerotic pornography, and they found it lewd and disgusting and horrible, and they didn't want it in their museum. So there was just a really big public outcry. For others, particularly in the gay community, this was art. So I use that example just to show you how challenging it is when community standards are not in agreement. So you have material that, while it could be stunningly beautiful to some, may be seen as completely disgusting to others. And I remember in the lower court arguments about this, it was very difficult for the attorneys involved, for the community members involved to really sort it out. And politics became involved because Mapplethorpe's work was funded by a federal grant coming from the National Endowment of the Arts, and it kind of blew up into a whole nightmarish situation. So again, I raise that example just to show you how difficult it is to define what is and is not obscene based on community standards. But that is the standard that's used. And you have to understand that as communities evolve, as ideas evolve, the standard shifts, the standard changes. Now, the Miller test, which I can't remember if this is included in your text or not. This is something I learned about, years ago when I started teaching this class. The Miller test involves some additional criteria and clarification. So again, you have this idea of the average person, and that means, from a social science standpoint, you have to kind of put your finger on the pulse of what are the community attitudes about various kinds of content. So would the average person, using community standards, find the work as a whole that it appeals to, quote, prurient interest? So you have to think about that. What would the average person think about particular kinds of material? And then second, whether the work depicts or describes in a clearly offensive way conduct, types of sexual conduct that would be problematic in terms of state law. And then finally, if taken as a whole, does the work have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? So what's being added here, you have this number one is the average person kind of standard, where would the average person find this offensive? Would the average person find it okay? The second one is what is being depicted in an offensive way conduct that could be defined under state laws as either okay or clearly problematic. So, for example, like bestiality, having sex with animals is still pretty much illegal any way you look at it. So material that presents that is going to be seen as a problem. It was going to be seen as obscene. And then the third standard has to do with determining, does this material, does this work have value beyond the presentation of the sexual material itself? Now, when we talk about the area of child pornography, that's one of those areas where there's pretty strong agreement. So if we go back to that average person and community standards, the average person tends to see pornographic depictions of children obscene, and they believe that they should be illegal. So child pornography, as you might have already guessed, images that clearly depict prepubescent human beings in sexually explicit ways. And why are they saying prepubescent human beings? They want it made clear that what's being presented is not just an adult that looks kind of young, but clearly a child that has not hit puberty and is being presented in this sexual way. So the federal law states that any visual portrayals of sexually explicit behaviors involving minors, that is pornography. And it is illegal to possess it, it's illegal to sell it, it's illegal to produce it. It's illegal to transmit it, if you're talking about online. So production, distribution, possession of child pornography is a sex crime. Child pornography typically involves a couple of related legal issues. You have prohibitions against the business side, production, distribution, and possession, but you also have the problem of children getting access to pornography, typically through the internet. And that's also an element of the whole child pornography universe that's out there. Now, Bridges did research on child pornography online, and what they found was that when they were looking at the best-selling pornographic films, an astounding percentage depicted some kind of physical violence, hitting, slapping, punching, kicking, restraining, up to and including sexual force. 49% included also verbal aggression, so shouting, saying degrading things, abusive language. Typical scenes in the best-selling porn films tend to include an average of 12 physical or verbal assaults. Now, for people who have not consumed pornography, this might be shocking, but for people who've had some exposure to pornographic films, and I don't just mean like the porn GIFs and the stuff that you can get on Twitter porn, which are short pieces, but these are full pornographic films. They tend to include a pretty steady diet of physical and verbal abuse. And typically, the people receiving the physical and verbal violence are women. The overwhelming, as I said, 94% of the targets of these aggressive images are women. And the women depicted typically are shown as either reacting with no reaction, or more common, they're shown enjoying the physical assaults that they encounter. So kind of a typical encounter would be a woman who is shown resisting, but then experiencing, ecstatically enjoyable sex after being forced, after being hit, after being strangled, after having their hair pulled, after being verbally assaulted. So that's the typical narrative that's included in these films. While you can find quote-unquote sex-positive porn, and there are some porn producers and directors out there who are women, who try to work within an industry that's very dominated by the type of pornographic film that I've just described, it's quite an uphill battle. So you can find some sex-positive porn with more diverse actors, with more positive forms of sexual encounters that don't involve abuse and aggression. It's still a rarity. It's still a relative rarity, and it is a business. So think about this: if the majority of pornographic films that are best-selling involve physical violence perpetrated on women, you have to think about who's buying it. They wouldn't make it if it wasn't purchased. So you need to keep in mind that there's a market for this, that people, and we're largely talking about men, are watching these depictions, and you have to really be concerned about what's being learned there. So what do we know about the effects of pornography? Well, there's been a lot of research on this, and it's difficult research to do. Some of the research that's described in your text, like in Cohen, looked at national data, and they found that, as I described earlier in a different piece of research, a very high percentage of men and a somewhat lower percentage of women have been exposed to pornography. A about 20%, 23% of men don't like pornography and are opposed to it. A substantially higher percentage of women, 43%, are opposed to pornography themselves. There has been found to be a positive correlation between pornography use and negative attitudes towards women. In particular, feeling like hitting women, pushing women, restraining women, and using force to have sex with women is okay. So as people report more consumption of pornography, so as that consumption number goes up, so does their support for saying violence against women is appropriate under some circumstances. Wright found in a couple of different studies that exposure to pornography, particularly for males, was correlated with a range of risky sexual behaviors. And that's in the researcher's definition of it. So for young men, they tended to have more positive attitudes about having sex as a teenager. They had more positive attitudes towards premarital sex, but they also had more positive attitudes towards having sex outside of your relationship. So remember that a lot of pornographic depictions involve these bizarre encounters, like the pizza guy shows up and eventually is having sex with someone. So there's an increase in permissiveness with permissiveness related to behaviors that are often by community standards seen as not necessarily good behaviors. For Bloom and Hangerton, they found that since pornography tends to involve impersonal sexual encounters, frequently involving coercion, and rarely including safe sex practices, they found an association between that and a variety of risky sexual behaviors. Casper et al. Also reported that people who were high consumers of pornography tended to report higher narcissism scores. Now, if you look at this list, you have researchers trying to come at this problem from a number of different directions. Just to hit the bullet points, though, if you look at this whole literature, and this is just a scatter shot of possibles, some of the things that you find in terms of negative effects of pornography are, given the content, the typical content of porn, you tend to see an association, a correlation between negative attitudes towards women, acceptance of violence against women, and belief in rape myths tend to go up with pornographic viewing. It's not a causal relationship. We don't know that watching porn causes those attitudes to occur, or if those attitudes make people more likely to consume porn, or if some other variable is driving the relationship between the two. But that relationship has been demonstrated repeatedly by multiple researchers. So there's something to it. What we don't know and can't say is the nature of the relationship. It's correlational data. It's frequently survey and interview data and therefore you can't make causal conclusions based on it. What we also know about pornography is that it tends to be associated with, again, it's a correlational finding, engaging in risky sexual behaviors, such as not using safe sex practices, not getting tests for STIs, for engaging in forceful sex, for engaging in extra-relational sex, and so on. Again, all correlational findings. So we don't have the ability to say if you watch a lot of porn, it's going to cause you to do X, Y, and Z. We don't have that kind of data. What we have is correlations, and you need to be careful to interpret them appropriately. So that concludes part 1 of our last chapter. I'll pick up here with part 2.